beneath a sky the color of rusted bronze, where the air hung thick with the scent of scorched earth and bitter myrrh. The city of Uruk once breathed like a living thing. Its heartbeat echoed through ziggurats carved from clay and will, pulsing through alleyways choked with incense and whispers, long before Babylon etched its ambitions into stone. Uruk had already risen, burned and risen again, its secrets layered like sediment, its memory trembling beneath the sands of time. But deeper still, below the golden myths and cuneiform, praise songs, lay rituals, not sung but bled, rites cloaked in silence, cloaked in shadow. The ancients called it Ioami, the temple of the crimson breath. It stood apart from the temples of trade and worship, a sanctuary walled not in grandeur but in dread. Built of blackened brick and veined alabaster, it bore no entrance the common citizen could pass. There were no chants in its courtyards, no laughter in its chambers. Only the flickering of oil lamps and the slow dripping of something that was not always water. It is said that once each century the gods demanded renewal, not through prayer but through offering, not grain or gold but life, and not just any life, the king's. The rite began in silence. At dusk, the royal household would gather, robes dyed in crimson, eyes downcast, faces painted with ash. The high priestess, always veiled, always barefoot, would raise a curved obsidian blade toward the western sky, where the sun fled the horizon like a hunted beast. She would utter a single word, lost now to history. It was called the word of undoing, believed to unweave the soul from the body. The king would then step forward, unarmed, unarmored, his crown replaced with a wreath of black reeds. But the king was not executed, no, he was unmade. Ancient tablets speak of the draining of the vessel. Some took this to mean bloodletting, but others believed the vessel was the king himself, emptied not just of blood, but of memory, will, lineage. His body was anointed in red ochre, his eyes covered with polished jet. The priestess would lay him upon a stone altar shaped like a lion's open jaws, and for 3 nights nothing was heard but chants in a language that no longer exists. Then, on the 4th morning, a new king would emerge, or rather, a reborn one, but not always. There are accounts carved in the oldest stone foundations of Uruk that tell of kings who did not rise, of dynasties that ended without war, without famine, simply ceased. Royal seals abandoned, records stopped mid-sentence. A new line would begin, often without explanation, ruled by one who bore the same name but a different face. The city accepted this, bowed to it, as if the rite had rewritten not just history, but memory. Archaeologists have uncovered these altars, obsidian slick and stained a deep, ruddy hue that no time has managed to fade. In the tombs of these vanished kings, no hearts remain. Each ribcage lies cracked open, the sternum shattered with surgical precision, yet no tools were found, no weapon marks, just silence and emptiness. One clay tablet, recovered half-burned from beneath a ruined temple, bears the fragment. To preserve the flame, the wick must be changed. The soul is oil, the body only the lamp. Another, buried in a stone jar sealed with pitch, contains what appears to be a warning. He who drains the vessel becomes the vessel, and the vessel weeps in dreams. Some believe the priestesses were not simply officiants, but hosts, that in performing the rite they received something, knowledge, prophecy, power, or something more ancient, more hungry. The line of high priestesses was said to never die naturally. They vanished, one by one, in the final week of each lunar cycle. No graves, no bones. Just the echo of their last rites sung into the wind. There is a tablet fragment from the reign of Lugalbonda, one of Uruk's earliest kings, that reads like a lullaby and a curse. Sleep not in crimson, eat not with silver hands, for the gods recall their due and take it in the shape of kings. Imagine now, if you can, that temple under the blood-washed sky, the scent of copper and cedar mingling in the stillness. A king lies supine, eyes closed, not trembling. Perhaps he believes this is honor. Perhaps he knows it is annihilation. Around him, shadows move in a silent dance. A knife glints. A hymn begins, low, slow, and mournful. The vessel is ready. The gods listening. What was the purpose of these rituals? Were they meant to cleanse the city of corruption? To renew divine favor? Or did the priestesses feed something below? Something slumbering in the foundations? Something that needed royal blood to stay quiet? The silence of Uruk today offers no answers. The sands have swallowed its secrets whole. But sometimes, in the dead of night, archaeologists report strange dreams after touching the altar stones. Visions of rivers turning red, of eyes staring from broken jars, of voices whispering in tongues they do not know, but somehow understand, and always a single phrase remains in memory, spoken by a voice both loving and hollow. You are the vessel now. The city of Uruk has fallen. But the crimson rites, if one listens closely, if one stands alone in moonlight with bare feet upon cold stone, may still echo. The blood may have dried, but the hunger never did. The wind never stops on the steps. It moans, it hums, it howls across the frozen plains like a voice searching for something it lost long ago. In the dead of night, it whispers through the bones of forgotten trees and dances over the ivory teeth of jagged cliffs. And in this endless breath of the earth, the Zungas once sang to their dead, not to bury them, but to lift them into the sky. Long before the great Khans rode eastward, and long after the empires of the south had forgotten their names, the Zungas kept to the highlands. They lived in tents stitched from horsehide, their fires low, their stories spoken in the language of wind and fire. Their gods were not golden or carved, they were elemental, untamed. The steppe itself was sacred, and the sky above, the eternal gate. When death came, whether through fever, blade or age, the body was not mourned in silence. It was prepared. The flesh, they believed, was a coat, a husk. To bury it would trap the soul. To burn it would scatter it before it was ready. So they turned to the air, to the birds, to the sky. The ritual was called Tengarine Yilchilgi, the skies attending. At first light, the body would be washed with melted snow and wrapped in crimson cloth. It would be carried on the shoulders of the kin, high up the ridges where the wind never ceased. There, in a circle of sacred stones blackened by age and lightning, the final rites would begin. The sky singers would come then, chosen from the line of the throat chanters, women whose voices could mimic the cry of hawks and the tremble of thunder. They would not speak. They would sing. The song was unlike any hymn, deep and layered, a harmonic haunting that reverberated through the rib cage like the breath of something older than man. It was said that the vultures, great carrion birds that circled like grey, spirits above, would only descend if the song was pure. If it faltered, even for a heartbeat, the soul would not ascend. It would be doomed to claw through the ice, blind and unwelcomed, gnawing at the roots of the world. But then something changed. The year was lost, perhaps in the 17th century, perhaps earlier. Snowfall came too early, and with it, silence. A monastery perched above the high pass of Congai collapsed under its own weight. When monks from the lower valleys climbed to rebuild it, they found the chapel torn open like a gutted beast, and buried beneath the shattered shrine, wrapped in ice and the shadows of forgotten rites, were 63 skulls, all facing inward, all marked by the same jagged cut, a notch carved just above the temple, deep and precise. No bones lay with them, no ribs, no femurs, just the skulls. As if someone had taken the time to sever, separate, and preserve only what once held the song. The markings weren't ritualistic, not decorative. They were crude, done with haste or rage. Some believed it was the work of invaders, outsiders, who misunderstood the practice, who silenced the singers before the sky could answer. But others whispered of failure. One scroll, half-burned and written in the old script of the mountain scribes, tells of a winter when no birds came. Bodies lay untouched for days, bloating beneath the white sun. The singers sang until their throats bled. Still, the sky remained empty. And then one by one they began to disappear. The text ends with a phrase so often repeated in Zungar funeral chants. But here it was scratched in with such force the parchment tore beneath it. If the sky will not take us, the earth will swallow us whole. To the Zungars, that was the greatest curse in the years that followed. Tales spread of wanderers who stumbled upon the high stones of the ritual ground and heard voices not echoing from above but rising from beneath, whispers that clawed their way up through frost-bitten rock. Birds refused to nest there. Foxes circled the site without approaching, and every few winters, when the snow melted just right, someone would find a piece of red cloth fluttering from a buried crevice, fresh, as if laid there only yesterday. There's one story passed down in hush among the old herders. It speaks of a young singer, Anyera, daughter of the last sky chanter. She was the last to try. After the others vanished, after the monastery was sealed in ice, she climbed alone to the sacred ridge with the body of her brother, a warrior struck down by fever. She sang beneath the black sun. Her voice cracked the silence. The wind held its breath, and then the birds came. But they did not circle. They did not descend. They perched. They watched. It is said she screamed at them, cursed them for their stillness, tore her hair, and offered her own flesh. Still, they did not move. And when her voice broke, when the song died mid-breath, she dropped to her knees and whispered the last line of the ritual, "If you will not take him, take me." Only then did the birds descend. No one ever saw her again. But from that winter forward, the wind that howls through those ridges changed its tune. Softer, sadder, almost like a lullaby with no words. The sky burials ended, the rites forgotten. But the wind remains endless, cold, alive. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you climb high enough, far from roads and warmth, you might hear it. A song without a singer, a voice with no breath, and the sky, heavy with silence, waiting for something it will never receive. The fire spoke before the words did. In the age when bronze still ruled and emperors consulted omens more than maps, the ancients of the Shang dynasty believed the future could be cracked open like a bone, not through hope nor wisdom, but through the flame's cruelty and the whispers it left behind. It was said that to question the heavens, one had to burn something sacred, and so they turned to the dead, the scapulae of oxen, the shells of tortoises, the remnants of beasts who once walked the earth, now destined to be vessels for prophecy. At dusk, in temples darkened by soot and sanctified blood, royal diviners gathered in silence. Long-robed eyes rimmed in kohl, they moved like phantoms beneath bronze bells and lacquered wood, past chambers reeking of ash and old ink. In their hands they carried the bones, smooth, yellowed, carved with questions. Not spoken questions, carved, for no voice dared interrupt the divine reckoning. Will it rain? Will the prince survive the sickness? Is rebellion rising from the south? Each inquiry sliced into the bone like a wound, thin, deliberate, sacred. Then came the fire. A heated rod, often of gold or iron, was pressed against the carved surface until the bone cracked. With a hiss and a shudder, the shell or scapula would fracture, jagged, unpredictable, divine. The pattern of the break was the answer, and only the trained, the Zunren, or truth-seers, could decipher the chaos. But over time, the questions darkened. Beneath the palace floors of Enyang, archaeologists found thousands of these oracle bones. But some were different. Not all bore questions. Some bore names. Dozens of them. Names not found in royal records. Names that never returned in family lines. Names erased. One in particular stands out. A scapula too large for any common ox, carved with a single inscription. Yinji, daughter of thunder, threat to the line. The cracks that bloom from her name resemble a spider's web, or a noose. No mention of Yinji exists in any history book, but near her bone, 7 others were buried in a stone jar, sealed with wax, all bearing women's names, all marked with the same pattern. Their bones never burned for prophecy again. Their names, it seems, were not questions, but commands. In time, the palace priests began to vanish, quietly, without scandal, without trace. Some say it was political factions warring in silence beneath the emperor's gaze, but others whisper of something far older, far colder. One legend, still told in the shadowed corners of Henan province, speaks of the fire that answers back. A curse born when a seer dared to ask a question he was forbidden to speak. How long shall the dragon line reign? The bone, they say, did not crack. It screamed. Those who heard it, 3 priests and a scribe, went blind by morning. One walked into the river and never emerged. The other 2 disappeared into the archives and sealed the doors behind them. When the emperor broke the seals, weeks later, he found them curled beside a smouldering brazier, eyes intact, minds shattered. And in the center of the chamber, carved into the stone floor by a hand that bled, the bone does not lie. You did, after that, the divinations changed. The fire grew colder, the bones more brittle. Answers became riddles, then nonsense, then silence. The last recorded oracle ritual took place on a winter solstice. The high priest asked no question. He simply placed his own name on the shell and held it over the flame. When it cracked, no one could read the pattern. They buried the bone beneath the temple and set the chamber ablaze. When it was uncovered centuries later, the name was still there, untouched by soot or time. But the crack had spread, not in lines, but in symbols. Symbols no language recognizes, as if the bone had answered in a tongue from beyond the stars. Now the bones rest in museums, cleaned, labeled, placed beneath glass. But those who spend too long studying them, who trace the grooves with too much curiosity, report strange dreams of fire without heat, of names spoken by shadows, of bones that twitch in silence when the lights go out, and always, in the distance, a voice like cracking ivory, murmuring from beneath the world. What would you ask, if you could never forget the answer? The bones no longer scream, but they still remember. The temple had no door, no steps, no carvings to welcome the devout or warn the foolish. It sat alone atop the limestone hills of Hattusa, veiled in fog that never quite lifted, wrapped in silence as thick as wool. A temple without an entrance, and within it the echo of feet that once moved in perfect circles. Dust remembers what stone forgets, and within that forgotten place, the dust still bears the imprint of narrow sandals worn thin by ritual. The mute priestesses, they were called, chosen at birth, offered, not asked. Their mothers wept in secret. Their fathers bowed their heads. For to give a daughter to the temple was both an honor and a quiet funeral. She would never again speak, not a cry in childhood, not a farewell in death. The gods of the Hittites were many storm lords, and earth mothers, judges and lovers, but in this place worship was given not in words, but in absence. Silence itself was sacred. Sound was considered a stain. From the age of 5, the chosen were veiled. From the age of 7, they were tongue-bound. The ritual was said to be painless. A small blade, a quick prayer, a cup of warm milk infused with poppy. Some survived, some bled out quietly. The survivors were no longer girls. They were vessels. The stone basin at the heart of the temple bore their offerings. Milk poured into the mouths of carved idols, faces with no eyes, mouths stretched wide in mockery of speech. The priestesses would sway in rhythm to drums made not of hide, but hollowed bone. Their bodies became language, every gesture a verse, every motion a plea. The gods, it was said, heard them more clearly than any spoken word, and yet something went wrong. One cuneiform tablet, buried beneath the ruins of a nearby granary, speaks of the silence that broke. It describes a night when the stars vanished, not clouded, but gone, and the priestesses danced to fast. They bled from the ears. One collapsed, trembling. When she opened her mouth, no tongue remained, only blackness, as if her throat led not to a body, but to something else. The high oracle forbade the rite for 7 moons. But on the 8th, the veils were donned again. The silence returned, and with it, the vanishings. First the youngest, then the eldest. No cries, no footprints leaving the temple, just absence, as if the air had claimed them. Archaeologists found no graves, no bones, but behind a cracked slab wall they discovered a chamber, circular, windowless, carved entirely from obsidian, and in the center a single sandal, child-sized, resting in a pool of congealed wax. Around it, inscriptions spiraling out like a spider's web, repeating the same 3 words in the old tongue. She is listening, not they, not we, she. Who was she? Some believed the temple did not serve the gods of the empire, but something older, something predating even the sky worshippers. A deity not of thunder or harvest, but of void, of unspoken things, of silence so deep it devours meaning. There is a legend passed down in fragments, once recited only by toothless elders in whispering dialects no longer written. It tells of a voice buried beneath stone, a goddess whose name is not spoken but implied in breath. It is said she sleeps in silence and feeds on forgotten prayers, that every time someone dreams of speaking but cannot, she stirs, and those who serve her, the mute ones, are not her slaves, but her ears. To dance without music, to bleed without scream, to vanish without trace. This is how you honor her. The temple still stands, cracked, weather-worn, forgotten, but sometimes, under the winter moon, hikers passing through the ruins report strange dreams, of circles that never close, of girls without faces, of a voice that cannot be heard, only felt, in the marrow, and the sound of bare feet pacing in dust that no longer moves. Do not call her name. She doesn't need your words. She already hears everything you do not say. The forest does not speak. It listens, and in the damp, endless hush of the Congolese night, where vines drip like veins and moonlight barely breathes, through the canopy something waits. Beneath the woven shadows, where twisted roots cradle, bones, stories curl like smoke, whispered only to those willing to bleed for truth. Here, among the silence and the steam, a name drips from the leaves, Guanajuato, leopard men. But the name is not shouted, it is not sung, it is swallowed, like flesh, like secrets. The Guanajuato were not a tribe, nor a people. They were a transformation, a brotherhood cloaked in myth and blood, who stepped out of the skin of men and into the hide of beasts. They wore the leopard's pelt, they mimicked its crouch, they filed their teeth to points, not for vanity, but for the bite, for the kill. The rite of passage was simple in word and unspeakable in practice. An initiate would be taken deep into the forest, beyond the reach of any village drum, where no gods dared follow. There, beneath a canopy older than empire, he would be offered a body. Sometimes it was a stranger, sometimes a brother, sometimes the mother who bore him. The choice was not his. That was the point. The blade was placed in his hand. The warm flesh opened. The tongue was the first cut. He had to eat it, with his eyes open, while the others watched. Only then did the song begin. Low, guttural, more growl than chant. A dirge from jaws that had forgotten language, remembering only hunger. The blood smeared upon his face marked the threshold. He was no longer a son. He was an animal now, a guardian, a predator in service to something older than law. The forest took him in to the outside world, to the missionaries who trembled in their iron churches and the colonial officers who marched with rifles and fear. These were crimes. But the corpses told a different tale. Men found with their hearts removed, not torn, but bodies posed in circles, too deliberate for madness, their arms folded like dancers in mid-spin. No signs of struggle, no footprints but those of bare feet, and claw marks carved into bark. Some nights a howl would rise, not wolf, not man. Something between, and then silence would crash down again, thick as honey, in time. Stories bled into documents. Reports filed in trembling script spoke of children vanishing, of hunters found with teeth marks on bone. Always the same markings. A perfect arc, a bite too human for beast, too bestial for man. One colonial administrator, upon entering a village, whose priest had been found flayed and kneeling upright, wrote only 4 words in his diary. They walk in threes. When asked what it meant, he refused to answer. That night, he vanished. His boots were found near the riverbank, carefully placed side by side. Inside them, human toes, but not his. Elders from the Mangbatu spoke of a power that could not be killed, only fed. They said the leopard spirit does not choose, it takes. It waits for a man hollowed by grief, pride, or vengeance, and then it enters through the wound. The Guanajuato, they whispered, were not men in masks. They were the vessel. They were the continuation of something sacred and terrifying. Their initiation was not just cannibalism. It was a surrender of self. To eat flesh is to remember what you truly are. One ritual, long forbidden and buried in story fragments, describes the midnight pool, a black basin hidden in a cave, where water and blood swirled together until the initiate saw not his reflection, but the beast he was becoming. It was said that if he hesitated, if the human in him resisted, the others would drown him in that pool, murmuring thanks as his last breath left his body in crimson bubbles. The forest keeps no records, but it does remember. It remembers the songs sung beneath bone altars, the gurgled laughter of men who forgot their names, the silence that followed every kill. It remembers the mother who called her son's name, even as he sank his teeth into her neck. It remembers the line between love and madness dissolving under a red moon. Even now, travelers say that in some corners of the Congo, where the trees grow too close together and the wind smells like copper, they feel eyes, yellow, patient, ancient, and sometimes, just before dawn, they hear something moving, not on four legs, not quite on two, something that stops when you stop and waits, when you pray, because the forest does not need your words. It has fed on your kind before, it will again, and somewhere, far beneath the moss and the rot, the Guanajuato still dance in circles, teeth gleaming, hearts pounding, songs unsung, waiting for another soul to offer itself to the dark. They say that desert has no memory, but that is a lie. Beneath its windswept silence, beneath the dunes that move like ghosts in prayer, the salt remembers. It clings to bone and breath, two secrets scorched beneath a sun too proud to set. In the eastern heart of what once was Persia, where the land is neither dead nor living, but something trembling between the ground speaks in silence. And if you listen long enough, you may hear the whisper of women who once walked through flame and did not scream. They were called the mothers of Ashdod. No men followed them, no temples bore their names. Their sanctuaries were hollows in the earth, caves etched by wind and the weeping of stars. The walls were carved, not with tools, but with the slow reverence of fingers coated in soot. Each chamber was sacred, lined with altars of black salt and cracked bone. And though time has tried to erase them, the desert still keeps the shape of their footsteps, bare, bleeding. Unafraid, they wore no robes, no gold, no sigils of kings, only veils of salt stretched over their skin, thin as breath, delicate as lies. Their bodies were painted with the dust of crushed obsidian, black as morning, sharp as truth. When they gathered, they did not speak. They hummed, a low, tremulous sound that moved through the caves like wind caught in a funeral shroud. It began at twilight, one by one. They descended into the sanctum, carrying torches lit from the bones of desert trees, their flames dancing low and hungry. The fire pit at the center of the chamber was not merely a hearth, it was the mouth of judgment. Around it, names of the dead were etched into salt slabs, husbands, sons, unborn daughters. To speak these names was to summon their breath once more, and as the chanting grew, slow, rhythmic, aching, the fire grew with it. Then came the trial, chosen by lot or by vision. A mother would step forward and walk barefoot into the flames. No pleading, no trembling, no glance behind. As her feet met the coals, she would recite a single name, a soul she wished to speak with, or a sin she could not release. If she withstood the fire, if her body did not yield, If her voice continued past the moment her skin should have blistered, she was named a seer, touched by the ashes of divinity, a vessel between the living and the unseen. But if she fell, if her voice cracked, if her knees gave way, if she became smoke, she was not cursed, she was sanctified, a martyr, an offering to the silence that watches all things burn. They were not madwomen, they were not witches, they were memory, and yet, centuries later, long after the empire that ignored them crumbled into its own dust, something strange was found. A sanctuary, half buried in the salt flats, uncovered by a rare and terrible storm. Inside, the stone walls still bore the charred fingerprints of obsidian hands. The fire pit had gone cold, but surrounding it were bones, dozens, women curled, in poses of prayer, hands still clasped, vertebrae bowed in eternal genuflection. But something was wrong. The skulls, they were fractured, not by heat, but from within, split clean down the center, as if something had burst through. And strangest of all, no ash remained inside the pit, only salt, piled high, white as bone, shimmering faintly with something, ... black ... What had they seen before they died? Some believe they called down spirits, too vast to behold, that the name spoken in those final moments tore reality wide, just long enough for their minds to fall through. Others say the seers went too far, that they glimpsed the fire behind all things, the secret that even gods dare not speak aloud. That knowledge cracked them open, that enlightenment in its truest form is a wound, but the desert does not offer answers. Only the echo of ancient breath caught between the stones. Even now, the wind moves strangely around that place. Travelers say their fires go out without warning, that dreams grow heavy with women's voices humming in unison, drawing them toward a darkness that tastes of salt and smoke. One man awoke screaming, claiming he had walked into flame and felt no pain, only cold. Like being kissed by the mouth of night, he never spoke again. Perhaps the mothers of ash never died. Perhaps they became the silence, the salt, the flame, that does not warm but remembers. Perhaps every cracked stone in that desert is the echo of a name once whispered at the edge of fire. We speak often of light, of what it reveals, but there is a holiness to darkness, too. To fire that does not illuminate, but consumes. To women who did not run from the flame, but entered it willingly, seeking not salvation, but memory. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery, not what they saw, but why they walked into the fire to see it, in the folds of Mount Parnassus, where the stone breathes mist and ancient gods sleep in the marrow of the cliffs. There is a silence deeper than death. It coils through the olive groves and stirs the dust that once clung to prophecy. And if you place your ear to the coldest rock at twilight, you might hear it, the voice of a child, whispering something you were never meant to know, long before Delphi became the throne of Apollo, before the Pythia's golden veil, before the scent of laurel choked the air with reverence. There were others, little ones, girls. They called them seers, but they had no names, only numbers, only offerings. They came from distant villages. No kin, no bloodline of pride, only the mark, wide, unmoving eyes, and silence so complete it made even the crows uneasy. The priesthood said they were chosen by the god, but they were selected by hands, wrinkled, greedy, trembling hands that believed truth was easiest pulled from the mouth of innocence. The girls were no older than 10 before they were taken. To the Adyton, the sacred chamber beneath the temple, they were made to drink from the Cassius spring. Its waters were frigid, cut from snow melt and sorrow, flowing through stone that remembered too much. The shock of it stole breath, slowed the heart, and opened the mind, or so the priests claimed. The truth was crueler. Asterisk. After the bath, the girls were locked away in chambers deep beneath the temple. Darkness was not punishment. It was preparation. Light was a liar, they said. True sight came only when the eyes were blind and the soul raw. The walls of those rooms still bear the scratchings, not letters, not words, just marks, dozens, hundreds, desperate spirals, fingernail deep. Some were kept there for weeks. They were fed honey and ashes, told to sleep when the bell rang, told not to speak unless the god moved them. Some began to hum. Others wept without sound. A few bit their tongues until they tasted iron and felt alive again. Then, one morning or night, they could not tell they were taken, blindfolded, carried up the winding path to the naos, the inner sanctum of Delphi. There, beneath a chasm, split into the earth like a forgotten wound, the god waited, so they said. The fumes of burning laurel and gases from the mountain's breath rose from a cleft in the rock. The priestesses, robed in white, mouths hidden, held the child's hands and led her to the tripod, a golden stool balanced like an offering itself. She would sit there, barefoot on the stone, the vapors curling around her like serpents of heedless fire, her blindfold removed, her eyes wide. They asked her questions. Sometimes she answered in riddles. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she screamed so high the olive leaves outside trembled. And sometimes, rarely, her words were written down. The wolf will dine on purple blood before the full moon. The lion walks backward into the sea. A king will rot in his bed of gold. When these words proved true, when kings died and earthquakes split the temples of the proud, and plagues bloomed like dark flowers, the child was declared divine. But she did not stay. None of them stayed. By 12, they were gone. The priests said the strain was too much for such fragile vessels, that the god's voice, even in whispers, shattered the body like glass. But no graves were ever found, no names recorded. Just one thing, deep in a forgotten archive, found buried behind a false wall in the sanctuary ruins, an inscription carved by a priest, whose name had been scratched out. It spoke of purifying the vessels, of a potion mixed with hemlock and hyacinth, of a soft death, clean and holy. But the last line was what chilled even the driest scholar's blood. If the voice remains, and the girl lives, then the god is not within her. Only the dead speak true. What became of them, those girls who lived past their usefulness? Were they silenced by cup or by blade? Or did some vanish into the stones themselves, their minds too full of secrets, their mouths sealed by fear? One whisper from a traveler tells of a woman, far in the north, blind and ancient, who spoke of fire beneath the earth and the blood of kings before it spilled. She laughed in riddles. She named dates that had not yet come, and when she died, they say her bones crumbled into white dust, as if the god had finally taken her back. It is easy, now, to revere Delphi for its grandeur, its marbled columns, its echoes of golden prophecy. But before it was glorious, it was quiet, and before it was quiet, it was cruel. Children should not carry gods in their mouths, and yet they did. And still the mountain remembers. When the wind sighs through the temple ruins, it moves like a lullaby sung too late. When the moon climbs high above the broken columns, its light casts shadows that seemed too small, too fragile, like little girls playing at priesthood, never knowing what waited in the dark. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the mists are thick, and no birds dare sing, a single voice may rise from the old stones, soft, high, and terrible beneath a bruised moon, where the jungle breathes in slow, steaming sighs. The ruins of Chichen Itza hold their silence like a secret, too sacred to whisper. Vines wind like veins through broken temples. The stone is warm to the touch, as if it remembers blood. And the wind does not howl here. It dances, in spirals, in veils, in circles drawn by unseen feet. They were called the veil dancers, not priestesses, not warriors. Something older, stranger, women who belonged not to the world of flesh, but to the moon's slow turning, and the obsidian shimmer of truth sharpened to a blade. Each night, when the silver crescent rose like a serpent's eye above the canopy, they emerged, draped in silk blacker than the night it touched. The jungle made way for them. Even jaguars held their breath when the rustle of veils stirred the air. Their steps led them, always to the same place, the temple of the warriors. At the top of that sacred pyramid, where once the living heart of kings had beat its last against cold stone, the women gathered in a perfect ring, and there they danced, barefoot, silent. The fabric of their veils shimmered like ink in motion, catching the moonlight and folding it into dream. Their arms moved in patterns no man dared to trace. Their feet struck the stone in rhythms older than language, and from their lips poured verses that no ear could remember come morning. Each line a spell, each breath a covenant. None of it was written, none of it survived, except in stone. One altar, unearthed after centuries buried beneath. The jungle's hunger bears their likeness. 7 women, frozen mid-spin, their veils trailing like smoke, but their faces gone. The stone shows no heads, only clean, bare necks, as if their very identity had been offered. It is said by whispers in Maya bloodlines, by stories passed from grandmothers who never blinked when the moon was full, that the ritual ended the same way each time. With stillness, the music would stop, the dancers would kneel, and the youngest among them, always the youngest, would step forward, obsidian blade in hand. Her veil would fall, revealing not beauty, not fear, but devotion so pure it burned. She would not speak, she would not tremble, she would kneel before the altar and place her neck upon the stone, and the others, still kneeling, would sing. One final note, then silence. There were no screams, no ceremony, only the thud of the blade, the weight of sacrifice. The pooling warmth of belief made flesh. What power did they believe? They stirred with such surrender. Some say it was Ixchel herself, goddess of the moon, of midwives and madness, of weaving and war. She who watched over the tides of blood and birth. The dancers were her daughters, they say, not by womb but by wound. Others say they danced for something darker, a force older than gods, a slumbering eye beneath the temple, waiting to awaken, not with rage, but with hunger. A hunger for the rhythm of devotion, for the surrender of the self, for the perfection of pattern completed in death. The truth is shrouded, swallowed, because no dancer ever returned. Each night a new girl was chosen, trained, veiled, given verses that would never be passed on. And each time she ascended, she did so knowing she would descend only in story, if at all. There are no burial sites, No names etched in walls, just veils. Hundreds of silk strands found caught between the stones of the temple, some blackened with age, some stained with something. Darker dot, and the blades, obsidian, razor sharp, balanced perfectly for the final act. Dozens found buried in a circle beneath the altar, each wrapped in cloth marked with a crescent, each waiting. The jungle has swallowed their voices, but not their presence. Even now, when the moon leans low and the fog curls thick around the ruins, some say you can see them, figures, faint and swaying, atop the temple of the warriors. No feet touch stone, no voices rise. Just veils caught in a breeze, no wind stirs. It is not a haunting, it is a ritual, repeating. The dance never ended, it only slipped into shadow, and perhaps that is what makes it sacred. Not the spectacle, not the sacrifice, but the silence left behind. The silence that knows what the world has forgotten, that some truths are meant to be bled, not spoken. So sleep now, beneath your warm sheets and starless ceilings. Let your dreams drift away from the edge of the jungle, from the shimmer of veils under a silver sky. But if you ever find yourself at Chichen Itza, alone beneath the moon, and the wind begins to circle your ankles like silk, do not look up. Do not follow the sound, because not every dance was meant for the living, and not every offering ends at the altar. They found the tomb by accident. A fault in the limestone wall had cracked open during a heat wave, the earth groaning softly in the dawn like something turning in its sleep. Near Tel El-Amarna, Akhenaten's forsaken city of sun and heresy, a cave revealed itself, veiled by centuries of sand and silence. At first, it looked unremarkable. A burial shaft, shallow, dry, forgotten, but beneath the dust, the stone glistened, not from gold, but from honey, thick, dark, ancient. The scent rose first, sweet, cloying, but tinged with rot, not the rot of flesh, but of time, of memory, of something preserved too long and never meant to be found. Inside, there was a body, bound tightly in reeds, its shape slender and delicate, more cocoon than corpse. Every inch submerged in golden honey, now hardened to amber resin, its shine catching the lamplight like a whisper. The face was hidden, the limbs wrapped, but something within it breathed a presence, still, weightless, watching. The tomb bore no royal cartouche, no pharaoh's name, no record in stone. And yet its care was unmistakable, deliberate, sacred. Symbols carved into the walls swarmed with meaning. Wasps in circular flight, scorpions poised with stingers lifted, lotus petals drifting down like tears. A chamber humming with insect worship, as if nature's smallest warriors would called to guard something too dangerous for men. The heart was missing. In its place lay a blackened orb of hardened resin, pressed with a dried lotus pod, shriveled, brittle, but untouched by decay. A substitute, or perhaps a seal. No inscription gave a name, only a pictogram of a figure, kneeling beneath the rising sun, arms open, bees pouring from the mouth in a spiral. Scholars gave it a name, the bee priest. But among the Bedouin, the tomb had a different title. Beit al-Asl al-Samit, the silent honey house. In the waning years of Akhenaten's reign, when he turned his back on the old gods and worshipped only the Aten, the disk of the sun whispers, say he opened more than minds. He tore a hole, in ritual, in order, in the harmony of divine hunger and human sacrifice. He created priests to match his heresy. One, it is said, was chosen not from lineage, but from suffering. A boy born during the locust eclipses, his mother stung to death by hornets in childbirth. He was taken to the house of sweet light, a secret temple hidden deep in the desert canyons where bees swarmed in sacred nests, and their honey was harvested not for food, but for rites. The boy never spoke. He was taught the language of wings. By the time he was 15, he could place his hand in a hive and not be stung. Scorpions crawled over his skin like pets. He drank fermented honey and read verses from scrolls made of waxed linen. His tongue, they say, was pierced with gold, and from it dripped prophecy. He became the mouth of sweetness, the vessel of stings. Neither priest nor prisoner, something in between. But the gods, the old gods, do not take kindly to substitutions. The sun, pure and blinding, could not shelter what stirred beneath the sacred veil. The boy began to change. His breath turned thick with pollen. His eyes swelled shut for days, only to reopen with black pupils like obsidian. Those who touched him claimed to dream of buzzing, always the buzzing, and of flowers that bled. From their centers, they say he once kissed a dying servant and bees crawled from her throat. He was buried not in death, but in fear, bound tight in reeds, steeped in honey, swallowed in sweetness so total that not even the rot could find him, sealed with sigils of scorpions, whose poison guards what sweetness cannot cleanse. Some believed it was an act of mercy, others containment. To this day, the body has not been removed from its amber tomb. Attempts to penetrate the resin failed, drills dulled, heat warped, and even the photographs blurred, as if the image itself refused to be held. One archaeologist, who insisted on analyzing a scrape of honey, fell ill with hallucinations. He spoke of wings under his skin, of a voice humming from within his teeth, of a queen in a black hive waiting beneath the sand. He retired the next day, blind in one eye, and whispering in his sleep in the soft night air of Tel El Amarna. Wind still moves across the broken pillars, through the empty temples that once worshipped only the sun. But beneath the ground, in that sealed chamber, the honey does not settle it. Shifts slowly, glistening as if breathing. What curse did they try to sweeten? What sting did they attempt to trap in amber? We do not know, but some nights, when the desert is utterly still, you can hear a hum, not loud, not threatening, just soft enough to drift beneath the sand and enter your dreams. So sleep, listener, with your windows closed and your ears turned inward. Let no buzzing touch your rest, for some sweetness is not meant for tasting, and some tombs were not made for death, but for silence, because what sleeps beneath Tel El Amarna is not forgotten, only waiting. The wind in the Balkan highlands does not speak. It murmurs, low and uneasy, as if carrying secrets too old for words. In the hours before dawn, when frost clings to bark and the earth exhales mist like a dying breath, there are stories that slip through the trees, stories not passed down, but bled out of stone, soil, and shadow. One such tale came from the mouth of a shepherd who had never seen the sea, whose eyes were always looking up at mountains, too ancient to remember their names. He found the mound by accident or by invitation, a circular rise in the earth where nothing grew, not even weeds. The sheep refused to tread near it. His dog whimpered at its edge. But the shepherd, perhaps dreaming or cursed, began to dig. What he unearthed was not a grave, it was a warning. At its center lay an iron crown, blackened by rust, its spikes dulled, but still pulsing with a quiet gravity. Around it, a circle of human teeth, scattered like offering stones. The bones of hands curled in gestures of prayer or agony. Shards of mirrors, all broken inward, their silver flaking like old skin. Burned parchment curled like dead leaves. The letters too scorched to read, but the scent of ink still sharp. No name marked the tomb, no banner, no heraldry, no sigil of kingship, only the crown and the inscription, etched on its inner rim in a language older than Latin, older than Slavic. Tongue, quae lucium devorvit. He who devoured light, the shepherd fled. He was found days later in a nearby village, his mouth sealed with wax, his hands blistered from holding something far too cold for iron. He never spoke again, but in his sleep he muttered names. Names no one recognized, not as people, but as emotions, dread, hunger, betrayal, names not meant to be named. There is no record of this king, and yet, in fireside tales, in the hush between mountain storms, the elders speak of a reign cloaked in shadow, of a ruler who forbade daylight in his court, who sat on a throne of carved obsidian, beneath ceilings painted with stars even at noon. He fed not on bread nor wine, but on the terror of endings. On prophecy torn from living mouths, they say. He invited 12 advisors, wise men, dreamers, priests, to counsel him in the matters of war and fate. Each night one was given wine mixed with poppy and root. As they slept, mirrors were placed around their heads, angled to capture every twitch, every whisper of soul departing when they died, their faces frozen in fear or awe. The king's scribes shattered the mirrors, fed the shards to a furnace. Then the ashes were mixed with oil and smeared across the king's eyelids as he dreamed. He saw futures, or believed he did. His reign was not marked by battles or temples. It was marked by silence, the kind that draped over valleys like fog. No birds, no bells, just the sound of breathing his own, shallow and rhythmic, echoing through halls lined with soot-black tapestries and mirrors veiled in gauze. They say his people began to disappear. First the elders, then the singers, then the children born, under eclipses, all taken to the inner chambers, never seen again. Only the smoke rose, sweet with marrow and incense, and the king, more spectral than flesh, emerged only to weep beneath his iron crown. Weep not out of sorrow, but necessity. Tears were sacred in his rites. They softened the veil between waking and vision. The crown absorbed them, rusting more with every drop. One by one, the advisors were used up, and when none remained, the king turned to his own blood. They say he carved open his arms and mixed the red with lamp oil, setting flame to mirrors cracked with his own reflection. He began to lose his name, his voice, his face, all given to the flames in trade for knowledge he could not hold. When his kingdom crumbled, if there ever was a kingdom, no enemy marched in, no rebellion stirred. It simply ... ended, vanished like breath on glass. Only the crown remained, that and the nightmares passed down by shepherds and stonecutters. Always the same dream, a figure with no face, seated in darkness, holding a mirror to your mouth as you sleep, watching, waiting, listening for the last word you will ever speak. And always, in the dream, the crown sits beside him, weeping. The crown now rests in a museum vault, under layers of lead and prayers. No one touches it, not because of rules, but because the interns refuse. One claimed it whispered in her sleep, in a voice she knew but could not place. Another saw his own eye reflected in the iron, even in the dark. There are things that should not be remembered. There are kings that ruled not over land, but over silence, over endings, over the light we carry in our hearts when all other lights fail. And perhaps, deep in the hills where the moss grows thick and the sheep still refuse to wander, the soil dreams uneasily because crowns, like curses, wait, they rust. Yes, but they do not forget. The wind in Anatolia is not always gentle. Sometimes it drags its feet across the plains like a mourner, low and mournful, threading through the broken teeth of ancient ruins. And in the buried bones of Catalyak, beneath layers of compacted time and sacred ash that wind learns to sing, they say the earth remembers what we forget. But in this place, it does more than remember. It whispers, the settlement sleeps. Under centuries of silence, yet it once pulsed with life, stone homes packed close, walls painted with ochre bulls and blood-red handprints. Fires once flickered in clay hearths. Children ran barefoot across rooftops. And always, beneath the floorboards, the dead listened. Here, the living built atop the bones of their ancestors, the tombs not distant, but close, folded into the breath of daily life. But there were other tombs, deeper, older, carved not beneath homes, but into the harder stone beyond the edge of the settlement, sacred, hollowed chambers sealed with care. And in these chambers something strange awaited. Each was lined with vertical shafts, thin and smooth, drilled at precise angles through the stone. They began above the surface and ended somewhere deep in the silence. No tools were found to explain their making, and yet, when the wind curled just right from the east in early spring, or after a midsummer thunderstorm, these shafts sang, not whistled, not moaned, sang a low harmonic resonance, like flutes mourning in unison, notes so deep they stirred the chest before they reached the ears. Some said the tones matched the rhythm of breath. Others claimed it echoed the heartbeat of the mountain. When these tombs were first uncovered, the archaeologists thought them decorative, or perhaps architectural vents for air, channels for rain. But the locals knew better. The shepherds who avoided the hill at dusk, the children told not to speak near, the stones, the grandmothers who folded evil eyes into their shawls when the wind changed. They had heard the tombs sing, and they knew that sometimes the tombs sang back. Records carved into bone and painted on pottery revealed a ritual lost to time, the rite of the wind's mouth. When a soul was ready to leave, the elders waited, not for the stars, not for the moon, but for the wind. It had to come from a certain direction, at a certain speed. Only then would the body be carried down to the carved chamber, placed among ochre and fire-charred bone. Only then would the shafts be unsealed. As the wind passed through, the tomb would hum its grief, and in the hum the soul would rise. It was said the wind lifted the spirit like smoke, wrapping it in melody so that it would not forget the music of the living. Mothers pressed their cheeks to the cold stone and swore. They heard their child's laughter rising in the wind. But some tombs refused to stay silent, long after they were sealed. With stone and ritual and salt, certain chambers continued to echo. Even on windless days, the notes became unfamiliar, dissonant, off-key like flutes, choked with ash. One woman swore she heard her husband's voice calling her name from beneath the soil, though he had died 20 years before, in a fire that scorched all trace of his body. Priests were summoned, rites were repeated. Still the sounds came. Some tried to fill the shafts with clay, but the sounds only deepened, as if the tombs were clearing their throats. One elder who spent a night beside the singing stone emerged pale and blind the next morning. He never spoke again, but carved spiral patterns into every wall of his hut until he died. A theory took root among the fearful that the tombs were not merely vessels to release the soul, but beacons, songs meant to call something home, not the dead, not entirely, but something older, something waiting. They said the tones were not prayers, but coordinates, that each note was a name, that the shafts were not flutes, but mouths. And once opened, mouths eventually speak back. In the final years of Catalyuk, the tombs were all sealed permanently. The shafts plugged with obsidian, rituals ceased. The settlement thinned, the paintings became darker, more frantic. Bulls no longer danced, they bled. Women once drawn in celebration now wept, arms raised not in worship, but in warning. Then silence, and the city slipped beneath the soil now. The tombs lie undisturbed, mostly hidden behind steel gates, monitored, catalogued. But every few years, a worker reports a low vibration. A guard hears something at night, not music, not quite, but breath. A long inhale, as if the earth itself were preparing to speak. Wind is just air in motion. But sometimes, in certain places, it remembers being a voice. And in the singing tombs of Catalyuk, the dead may still be listening, not for release, but for response. So, when you next walk where the wind bends the grass, and the hills seem to murmur your name, listen closely. If you hear the earth begin to hum, walk softly, do not answer, and never sing back. There is a lake in the Carpathians that does not reflect the sky, even under moonlight. Its surface broods crimson, a still, dark stain on the earth, as if some ancient wound was never allowed to close. They call it Lacula. San Jero's the bloody lake, and the wind that brushes its surface carries the taste of iron. The villagers do not speak of it at noon, when the sun is bold, but near the solstice, when the days stretch thin and the nights press close, they remember. They bolt their windows. They place sprigs of wolfsbane by the door, and they whisper warnings to the children. Never follow the singing past the trees. Never drink from the lake. Never walk barefoot on the red shore. But long before it was feared, it was worshipped, before the forest grew thick with secrets. Before Rome laid its roads through these mountains, the Dacians called this land home. A proud people, bound to the stone and snow, whose rites were carved not in scrolls, but in the marrow of the earth. Their gods had no names, only echoes. Their temples had no roofs, only stars, and their greatest altar was not made by hand, but by time. The crimson lake, it was not always red. That came later. After the blood, the old songs speak of a gate in the water. Not a metaphor, not a vision, a true crossing. A mirror too deep to touch bottom, where the soul, freshly untethered, could pass into the mountain's heart. But the journey was not given freely. It had to be bought, and the price was always blood. Each solstice, when the veil thinned, when the stars wheeled just right, the priests gathered in silence, not robed in gold, but in ash, their faces smeared with the dust of ancestors. Around the lake they formed a circle, each bearing a hollowed stone bowl carved from the bones of the mountain. Black with age, smooth with use-dot, from the forests came the chosen, sometimes willing, sometimes not. They were not sacrificed in haste. There was no frenzy, only reverence, a stillness like the breath before dawn. The blade was not sharp, but sacred, drawn slowly across the throat, allowing the blood to pour, not on the earth, but into the stone. One drop, two, then poured upon the lake's surface. Where it did not disperse, it sank as if the water itself drank. They believed this act bound the spirit of the dead to the land, not in mourning, but in eternal guardianship. The Dacians did not fear death, they welcomed it, a return, not a departure. And in that crimson offering, they saw not loss, but transformation. When Rome marched eastward, crushing gods and burning altars, they found resistance in these mountains like nowhere else. The Dacians did not flee, they fought with blood in their mouths and fire in their hands. Legionnaires sent to occupy the region reported strange visions near the lake, ghostly figures walking through fog, voices humming from beneath the water, blood seeping into the soil even in the absence of rain. One centurion, hardened and twice promoted, went mad after a night posted near the shore. He was found babbling about eyes beneath the surface and the mountain that breathes. Before he could be brought back to Rome, he vanished into the mist. Only his sword was found, wet, warm, waiting. The final accounts tell of Roman soldiers stumbling upon the Dacian priests in mid-ritual. They expected chaos, but found stillness. The priests stood unflinching, blood in hand, as if offering not surrender, but invitation. The soldiers slaughtered them where they stood, burned the forest, salted the lake, but the water did not boil. It drank, and for days after, the lake glowed, faintly red, not from sunlight, but from within. Generations passed, empires rose and fell, the cults dissolved, but the lake remained. And every solstice, despite all reason, the waters darken, not by flood, not by bloom, but by something else. In recent years, a core sample was taken from beneath the silt. It was meant to test sediment levels, to understand the lake's age. But what it revealed could not be explained. Human hemoglobin, ancient, preserved, still echoing through the layers of water and time. How does blood live where no body remains? The villagers no longer ask. They know some truths are not meant to be solved, only survived on the coldest nights. When the frost clings like breath to the glass, travelers claim they hear singing by the lake, a low melodic hum, as if the wind itself were remembering a forgotten prayer. Others speak of shapes in the trees, not men, not beasts, but watchers, tall, silent, wrapped in the scent of smoke and iron, and some, foolish or cursed, have tasted the water. They return different, slower. Their eyes no longer focus. They dream in languages no one taught them. They speak of gates beneath the surface and voices that rise in the night. The crimson lake does not seek worship now. It only waits for blood, for memory, for the echo of footsteps returning to the shore. So if you find yourself wandering the Carpathians near the solstice, and the fog curls too tightly, and the air smells not of rain but rust, turn back, do not follow the music, do not answer the voices, and if you see the lake glowing faintly, rippling without wind, close your eyes and walk away. They say sound never truly dies, that a whisper, once birthed into the air, echoes forever in places where silence knows how to. Listen in the deep, rose-burnished silence of Petra, where the stone itself wears the hue of old blood and forgotten incense. Such whispers seem to curl around every corner. The air feels thick with memory, and the cliffs speak in breathless pauses. The Nabateans carved their city not with tools, but with reverence, as though the very desert rock were a living thing that required coaxing, not conquest. Temples rose from canyon walls, like secrets unfolding, smooth, solemn, eternal, and beneath those temples, jars, not many, not in plain view, hidden beneath altars, sealed with ancient tar, buried in small clusters, as if to anchor something that once drifted too close to the veil. The first of them was unearthed at dusk, as the sun died in streaks of orange across the ridges, and the wind, dry as bone, slid between pillars, like a mourner with no voice left to grieve. The jar was unremarkable at first glance. Simple, ceramic, unpainted, its neck carefully bound in blackened resin. A preservation method, they assumed, perhaps for perfume, oil, dust. But there was no scent, no liquid, nothing. Just a weightless void that pulsed faintly when held near the chest, like a heartbeat long buried, still echoing through the clay. One of the workers, a young man named Firas, laughed nervously as he cracked it open. He held the jar close to his ear, like a child might hold a conch to listen for the sea. Then he froze, his eyes widened. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. He trembled, seized, then collapsed, mouth still agape, eyes locked, on something no one else could see. He did not die, but he never spoke again. He only stared and hummed a high, almost imperceptible note, like the ringing left after a thunderclap, a sound that made the desert birds fly wide and far. After that, the dig halted for weeks. Fear is not an official archaeological tool, but it has its own weight. Yet some among the crew, especially those who knew the legends, were not surprised that Nabateans were a people of traders, builders, stargazers, and mystics. Their rituals blended earth and ether. They believed the breath at the moment of death was a passage, not merely air escaping the body, but the very soul slipping free. And if caught, if captured in time, that final breath could be sealed, like incense, like memory, for the gods to one day hear. These were not jars of ashes, not reliquaries of bone. They were vessels of last words, bottled prayers, whispers meant to echo into the beyond, and Petra built in curves and crescents. Like a celestial ear pressed to the cosmos was their altar. The texts are rare, etched into fragmented walls in flowing Nabatean script. One phrase repeats more than any other. His whisper returns when the stars align. Another, in clay, the soul waits. Over the decades, more jars were uncovered, always buried, always beneath sanctified ground. Most remained sealed. A few, when opened, gave off faint sounds, not quite language, but almost a hush that seemed to come from inside one's skull rather than the jar. One worker wept. Another heard their name spoken in their grandmother's voice, long dead. Coincidence, they said. Echoes of the mind. But no one could explain why every opened jar caused birds to vanish, insects to still, and shadows to stretch just a little too far. There were other stories, older still, of priests who would breathe into these jars the final confessions of the dying, capturing not just words, but the fear, the repentance, the ache of unfinished life. The jars would be buried with precise orientation, aligned with certain stars. Sometimes they would be left atop cliffs overnight, to season in the moon's gaze. Then entombed once their silence was complete. No one knows how many were made, or how many remain buried. The man who found the 12th jar, an older scholar named Dr. Halim, insisted on opening it alone. He'd spent years chasing whispers in stone, tracing desert lines like veins on an elder's hands. He believed, truly, in the sacred sound, that the soul was not a flame, but a note, a tone too sacred to fade. He cracked the seal beneath a full moon. He said nothing at first, only closed his eyes. Then, softly, almost reverently, he said, "It said, I am still here." After that night, he too stopped speaking, not out of fear, they claimed, but awe. He wrote pages, filled journals, but never again used his voice. When asked why, he simply pointed to his throat and smiled, as if a song lived there now that no language could shape. Petra, with its shadowed gorgeous and half-buried gods, remains a city of echoes. Tourists come and go, snapping pictures of the facades, the treasury, the monastery, never knowing what sleeps beneath. But the wind still dips strangely between the stones. And some say, on nights when the stars are dense and the moon high, if you press your ear to the earth and breathe slowly, you'll hear it. A whisper, a word without language, a sound without age, something ancient trying to return, carried not by air but memory. And so the jars remain, scattered, waiting, silent but not empty, holding within them something more delicate than bone, more enduring than gold, the breath of the forgotten, and the hush of a soul sealed in clay. Still whispering its name into the silence, snow falls in silence on the island of Hokkaido, thick, slow, and solemn, as if each flake carries the weight of memory. In the hush of winter, the forests breathe shallowly. Trees, black-limbed and dusted in white, stand like sentinels over the forgotten rites of a people whose voices now linger only in wind and stone. The Ainu children of the northern frost carved their rituals, not for spectacle, but for communion. Their world was a tapestry of breath and bone, of spirits woven into rivers and foxes and flame. But beneath the snowy earth, where warmth vanished and the earth grew narrow and dark, they kept their deepest magic, a place not for the living, but for the passage between, beneath certain ceremonial huts, now reduced to rotted beams and matted moss. Archaeologists found signs of something hidden, not graves, not cellars, but tunnels, spiraling downward, bone-lined, carved with hands long gone and hearts unafraid of the dark. They call them mazes, but these weren't puzzles. They were maps, not of land, but of soul. The Ainu believed the spirit, upon sensing its departure, required guidance. Not a priest, not a chant, but a journey. And so the shamans, white-robed and wind-burnt, would descend into these winding passageways with only a bone, flute, and a clay jug of fermented mare's milk offerings for the spirits that curled. Between earth and ether, they entered alone, always alone. Above the village would sing a rhythmic, low chant, not in mourning, but in invocation. The vibration of voices was meant to reach the tunnels like a rope through water, anchoring the shaman to the world of breath. But if, during that descent, the shaman heard the cry of the fox, a sharp, spiraling wail in the dark, it meant the soul had been lost. Some say the fox was the gatekeeper. Others claim it was the Devour in Ainu lore. The fox, kitsune, was a spirit of dual nature, wise, cunning, dangerous. It could lead or mislead, heal or haunt. It was the keeper of crossroads, especially those between life and the shivering unknown. There is a tale of a shaman named Tomo, whose visions foretold her own death in the turn of spring's thaw. She asked her apprentice to prepare the descent, to gather the bones of ancestors, polished and sacred, and shaped the path beneath the shrine. She insisted the center be left untouched, for something older waits there. She whispered Dot. When the day came, clouds hung low like morning veils. The snow was still, but the wind had teeth. She descended as the chant began, her footsteps steady, her breath forming ghosts against the cold clay walls. She played her flute as she walked, a haunting, hollow melody, like weeping wind through a broken reed. Her apprentice sat above, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour, then the fox cried, not from the forest, but from within, a sound sharp and rising, neither animal nor human, but something stretched between. The chanting stopped, the air grew still. The apprentice, against all law and fear, lit a pine torch and crawled into the tunnel to find her. But the path twisted and twisted, then closed. He returned alone, eyes wide, hair turned white from terror or frost. He spoke only once in the weeks that followed. She found the heart, but it had teeth. Years later, when another team unearthed one of these bone mazes, they noted something peculiar. No path ever led to the center. Every tunnel curved, turned, and mirrored, but none reached the deepest point. Not by accident. It was as though the very heart of the maze refused to be found, or worse, waited. The bones used to build the walls were not random. They were selected from deer, foxes, birds, humans, polished, arranged in precise angles. They hummed faintly when touched. Some were carved with symbols to faded to translate. But one repeated often, silence is the final teacher. Many of the tunnels remain sealed. Others have caved in, reclaimed by frost and moss. But in one, still partially open, researchers lowered a microphone. The feed returned no voices, no steps, but a tone, faint, rising, like breath through bone, and in the distance, something almost like a cry. Was it the fox, or something that learned its voice? No one enters the mazes now. Not truly. They linger at the mouths, they measure, they record, but they do not descend. Because what waits in that quiet spiral, that bone-clad descent into breathless cold, is not for those who seek, it is for those who are called. The Inu did not build these for death, they built them for return, for the slow unwinding of spirit. Through darkness, for the final offering to the unseen, for the soul to find its silence or its echo. In the company of bones and the wail of the fox that never forgets a name. And even now, when snow falls heavy and the trees lean close to listen, the forest breathes that same hush, that reverence, that pause between heartbeat and nothing. Somewhere below, in that eternal spiral, the flutes have fallen silent, but the maze still listens. There are places in this world where silence does not comfort, it haunts, where the wind does not sing, it whispers, and where the light of the sun seems to turn away, as though what lies below is not meant for its gaze. High in the bone-brittle ridges above Lake Titicaca, where clouds press heavy against the earth and shadows cling to stone like old regrets, there is a place the Quechua shepherds will not name. They only point, when pressed, to a cleft in the rock that drinks in the mist and exhales nothing, a cave, hidden for centuries. Not by accident, but by intention. The Incas called it Naui Kewe Punku, the door of seeing eyes, though none who entered ever returned with their vision. Intact, when the seal was broken, an act perhaps never meant to happen, the explorers expected relics, bones, maybe a shrine. What they found instead froze every tongue. Still as the mummies themselves, 13 figures, seated in a perfect inward circle, cross-legged, draped in faded woven robes, their heads bowed gently as though caught mid-brow, their faces weathered by time and cold, but their eyes were gone. In their place, crystals, not jewels, not stones, salt, white and raw, grown from the hollows like blooming wounds. Each skull a silent chalice, overflowing with a harvest of silence. No signs of violence, no screams held in muscle or tear in tendon. The bodies, when touched, felt not like death but slumber. They had not been forced, they had not struggled, they had chosen. On the wall behind them, carved deep into the volcanic stone, was a single line of Quechua script, worn but legible. See no vision but the final. What did they mean? Some believed they were seers, Pacos, prophets of the empire, not political, not royal, but sacred. Their visions came not through drink or smoke, but through blood, through sacrifice, through silence, and perhaps through blindness. The legend tells of a time when the empire trembled, not from enemies, but from within. A sickness, not of body, but of soul, a darkness said to be born beneath the earth, where the gods themselves feared to tread. It was said the 13 of the wisest dream-seers were called to confront it, but they could not see it in the world above. They had to go inward, beyond light, beyond form. The rite was old, even then. Salt, the sacred purifier, was pressed into their eyes. The pain, they say, opened the final gate. And through that gate they walked. What did they find? Some whispered they saw the end of the world, not in fire, but in forgetting. A slow crumbling of names, of meaning, of memory, that one day the sun would rise and no one would remember how to greet it. Others say they saw nothing. A blank, eternal silence, the universe staring back with empty eyes, unblinking and uncaring. But the most feared tale was that they did not see a future, but a choice, a mirror held to the soul of humanity. One path wound toward harmony, the other toward hunger, and in that vision they saw which path we had already chosen. So they sat, and they stayed, waiting, watching with blind, salted eyes for a world that might still turn back. One of the explorers who entered that cave later confessed, though his voice shook with every word, that as he stepped into the circle, a pressure gripped his chest, like breath held too long. He said it wasn't fear, it was recognition. He looked into the eyes of one of the mummies, and for a moment, a flicker, he saw it blink. Not physically, not truly, but in the place where dreams cling to waking. And in that blink, he saw it too. The unraveling, the forgetting, the storm of dust where cities once stood, and names once meant something. He collapsed. When he awoke, his vision was blurred. It never fully returned. They sealed the cave again not long after. Not with ceremony, not with science, but with a kind of reverent dread. They left behind offerings, coca leaves, shells, feathers, as though to beg forgiveness for trespassing into a place where sight had been traded for truth. The salt remains, locked in those sockets like frozen tears. What vision had been so terrible, so magnificent, so final, that it demanded blindness? What does it mean to choose not to see, not out of fear, but out of sacred purpose? In the Andes, where the stars feel close enough to touch, and the wind carries voices long vanished, the shepherds say that on certain nights, when the moon is swollen and white, if you stand too near that forgotten ridge, your eyes begin to ache. A pressure, a sting like salt behind the lids. They say it's a warning. Others say it's an invitation to sit, to close your eyes and see what waits in the dark behind the stars. They say the wind never stops on the steppe. It moans like a wounded beast, dragging itself across 1,000 miles of dust and memory, where even the earth has forgotten its name. Beneath this endless sky, a silence lives that predates language, a hush so deep it can drown even time. To the east of the Caspian Sea, far beyond the reach of cities and maps, lies a land of rust-colored grasses and salt-stung winds. Here, the sun hangs low and heavy, like an eye swollen from watching too long. And in the folds of this forgotten plain, a mystery endures, buried beneath the soil, beneath the years, beneath the breath of gods long dead. They called themselves nothing we remember. The empire they built, if it was an empire at all, has no name in our tongues, no walls, no coins, no written word. Only the bones remain, and the chalices, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each found clenched between the mandibles of human skulls, not resting, but fused. Copper lips welded to bone, as though the dead had swallowed the cup whole and carried it with them into silence. They were discovered in burial pits, crude, circular, sunken into the earth like the echoes of vanished campfires. Each pit held its own hush, deeper than death, lined with relics of ritual, shards of carved antler, frayed braids of horsehair, and grasses long dead, still clutched in the mummified hands of the fallen. The steppe people, say the elders, of nearby villages practiced something they called the thirst rites, a communion, yes, but not of bread and wine, a final drink for the dying, not to ease suffering, but to transcend it, to rise beyond the skin and the stomach, to step, barefoot and unburdened, into a place where neither hunger nor time could follow. The sacred dew, they whispered, was drawn from the morning grasses, gathered with the tenderness of a lover's breath, before the sun could claim it. Only the purest dew, glistening like the tears of sky-born spirits, was offered, sipped in silence just before the soul departed. But when the copper vessels were tested, long after their stories had crumbled into dust, something darker was found. Traces of blood, human, some said, animal, others, opium, thick and ancient, still clinging to the seams, and something finer, stranger, ground bone, not crushed by accident, but ritually reduced, mixed in with the liquid like ash in incense. Was this communion or conquest, masked in sanctity? No one knows who these people were, or what gods they called upon in those final breaths, but the signs on their remains tell of agony and ecstasy intertwined, wounds healed and reopened, teeth filed 2 points, hands folded not in rest, but in posture, as if still gripping an unseen thread. One legend survives, in half whispers, carried on the wind by shepherds, who sleep with knives beneath their pillows. They say that long ago, when the steppes were green and the stars more numerous, a drought came that lasted 12 years. Horses died first, then the rivers, then the names. The people, desperate to endure what the gods had abandoned, turned not to war, but to vision. They believed thirst was not a curse, but a test, a bridge to something vast and unspeakable. Those closest to death were given the dew, sweet, sacred, laced with the crushed bones of the elders who had come before. And in that final sip, they glimpsed the veil. Some returned, eyes glassy, speaking of a land where hunger no longer followed, where the wind was warm and the grass whispered secrets. Others never woke. their jaws clamped around the cup as if death itself was still. Mid-sentence, but one tale remains. Most feared, it tells of a warlord, a priest-king with copper eyes, who twisted the rite. No longer was the dew gathered by night and blessed by the moon. Instead, blood was taken from the conquered, their marrow ground into the chalice. The opium harvested not for peace, but for domination. He offered his victims the same cup, made them see before death what he wanted them to see, not peace, but surrender, dressed as transcendence. And thus, the rite once sacred became a tool of terror in time. His name was lost. The sky took it. The grass buried it. His bones were scattered to winds, too tired to remember. Now only the cups remain, and the silence they carried when one was unearthed. Jaw still locked around the rim. A wind rose suddenly, though the sky was still. The archaeologist who lifted it heard a sound, she said. Not a voice, not quite. More like the sound of thirst itself, dry, endless. Ancient. She set the cup down and never returned to the field. They say that to hold one is to feel it, the longing not for water, but for understanding, a thirst not of the body, but of the soul, the kind that no river can quench. And in that thirst perhaps lies the truth of these vanished ones. Maybe they sought not survival, but meaning. Maybe the final drink was not to escape time, but to stare it in the face, wide-eyed, unflinching, lips wet with blood and dew. And maybe, just maybe, they succeeded in the stillness of the steppe beneath the great dome of the sky. The wind still carries their prayers, brittle and soft, like cracked copper in a dying fire. Drink, they whisper, but only if you are ready to see what lies beyond the hunger. In the hush between lightning and thunder, there is a moment when the world holds its breath, when the trees bow low, the soil stirs, and something ancient listens. It is in this trembling silence, heavy with rain and memory, that the old gods of the Khmer highlands awaken. Not in temples, not in scrolls, but in water, black, swirling, alive. And in that black rain she waits, Sreka, the bride not of man, but of the storm. The hills east of the Tonal Sap rise like wet lungs in the monsoon, breathing mist and secrets. Before Angkor, before stone towers and saffron-robed monks, the jungle here belonged to another world. Moss-joked, spirit-haunted, pulsing with ceremonies too old for record and too sacred for retelling. The people who lived there did not build cities. They built moments, rituals stitched into the rhythms of rain and root. And once every 12 years, when the rivers swelled and the sky wept for days without end, a girl was chosen. She was always 16, always from the same bloodline, though the names changed, the face did not. Slender, solemn, veiled in indigo, so deep it swallowed light. They called her Srey Kansia, though in older tongues her title meant offering of the mouthless sky. She was led barefoot into the flood-soaked clearing where 3 rivers, the Sekong, and the forgotten Thmei, tangled like serpents beneath the trees. No torches were carried, only drums, slow and low, echoing like a heartbeat. Buried in mud, palm leaf manuscripts, brittle as moth wings, speak of the rite in fragments. On the 9th thunder, feed her the earth, the storm shall bloom. Beneath the carved canopies of dying banyans, a shallow bowl of fermented river mud was lifted to her lips. She drank, slow, deliberate, and closed her eyes. Then came the leeches, placed, not by accident, but in sacred order, along her arms and back. Symbols, they said, of the land feeding on what is given freely. Witnesses, if any remain, do not speak of what happened next, but legend coils its way through the villages, whispering that she never screamed, that when the drums reached their highest fury and the sky split in white veins of fire, she stepped into the ravine, not dragged, not pushed, but invited, and vanished beneath the cataract like ink in water. The storm stopped an hour later. Not faded, stopped, as if satisfied. Those who lived near the ravine swore the rains changed after each wedding. Crops surged. The air thickened with fruit. Children were born without fevers. But birds no longer nested in the trees above the rivers. Dogs would not cross them. And deep at night, from beneath the earth, came a sound like laughter through waterlogged wood. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell like the tides. The highland people disappeared into absorption or erasure. But in the vine-split ruins of temples older than Angkor Wat, images remained, carvings of women with smooth, eyeless faces, all turned upward, mouths parted, arms outstretched in rain, smiling. Rain, always rain. No weapons, no gods, just the presence of water and those who gave themselves to it. One stone relief, nearly intact, shows a hand reaching from a churning river, not in desperation, but in offering, clutching what looks like a bolt of lightning. Folded into silk, modern hands could not decipher the glyphs. The language is dead, but the patterns repeat. Spiral, eye, river, drum, a cycle, a contract, perhaps even love. For what is a wedding if not surrender? And what is rain if not the sky kissing the earth? There are still elders who, when the thunder rolls too long, place bowls outside to catch the first drops. Not to drink, but to listen. They say the water holds her whisper, that if you listen closely, you'll hear her name drawn into your marrow. Kansha, soft, slow, trailing like incense smoke through a dreaming room. One monk, now long dead, wrote in a faded journal of the last time he walked through those hills. He had been young, brash, disbelieving. But when the rains came, he saw something at the river's edge. A girl in indigo, barefoot, her arms outstretched, not walking, but gliding over the current. Her eyes were closed. She smiled. Then, as thunder cracked above, she dissolved into mist. He never returned, but the journal remained, wrapped in silk stained with mold and river silt. To this day, no one has found the precise ravine. The rivers have changed their course, as rivers do. Trees have swallowed what was left. But sometimes, in the deepest floods, the villagers claim to see silk tangled in branches. And on certain nights, the rain falls heavier in one place, pounding as if summoned, and the drums echo without hands. Perhaps the storm remembers. Perhaps it waits. And perhaps the bride, one of many, or the same soul, returned again and again, continues her vow beneath the world, dancing forever with thunder, her indigo veil trailing behind her like a cloud with no sky. She did not drown. She became rain. There are places the sun forgets, not by accident, but by design. Beneath the wind-scoured ridges of Sardinia, where the ancient Nuragic towers crumble into thorn and dust, there breathes such a place, cold, unlit, and humming like a distant heart. They call it the Court de Luminous, the Court of Light, but the light there does not soothe. It does not reveal. It blinds. The miners who first uncovered the passage in 1864 did not speak of discovery with joy. Their picks rang against a seam of stone that did not echo properly. It swallowed sound. When the barrier broke, a rush of air greeted them, not stale, but fragrant. Wax, myrrh, and something metallic, like breath, caught on the edge of blood. One stepped inside and returned pale, shaking, whispering of voices that did not echo, and stones that sang when touched. The shaft was sealed within days, not out of fear, but reverence, as if the living had trespassed on something not dead, but dreaming, long before the miners, before Rome, before even Carthage. The Nuragic people built in silence, towering round fortresses with no mortar, no script, no empire, only stone, rhythm, and sky. They left behind no written word, but they left behind something deeper, the labyrinth, carved not above ground but into it, spiraling inward through chamber after chamber, each colder than the last. Walls bore no markings, save for long, shallow grooves, finger-widths like trails of melted wax. Local shepherds still whisper the tale around fires on storm-thick nights, of the candle and the spiral, of the rite that could summon memory from bone. The initiate, always alone, was blindfolded. A single beeswax candle was placed in their palm, already lit, with eyes. Veiled and vision denied, they entered the mouth of the labyrinth. The flame was not to guide, but to witness. The only way forward was by echo, footstep, breath, the tremor of one's own pulse bouncing off ancient walls. To stray too far from the spiral's song was to vanish. The candle was a thread between the living and the dead. Each chamber contained a spiral traced into the floor. In its center, a melted stub of wax. Around it, bones, human, kneeling, walking, frozen mid-motion, their skulls tilted slightly downward, as if listening. No record exists of what lay in the final chamber, only that those who reached it and returned would wake days later, unable to speak for weeks, their eyes light-blind even in darkness. When they spoke again, their words were fragmented, unearthly. Some sang in languages no one knew. Some painted visions of faces with no features, standing around pools of gold light. One carved a spiral into the stone wall of his hut, then walked into the sea and was never seen again in 1972. A small archaeological team reopened the first chamber under the guise of academic research. The air inside was still warm. In the center of the room sat the candle, melted to the floor in a familiar spiral. A waxy scent hung heavy, as though the flame had only just gone out. They say when the lead researcher touched the spiral, she wept, though she did not know why. Later, she dreamed of endless corridors filled with singing dust. She left the project within weeks and never worked again. The rest of the team sealed the chamber once more. Official records claim instability, but unofficially, they had heard something. A sound beneath the sound, not quite music, not quite voice, a thrum that vibrated in the blood like memory remembered by the bones today. The entrance is hidden beneath a thicket of oleander and thorn, watched only by wind and time. But the labyrinth still breathes. The candle still waits. They say the rite was never about light. It was about surrender, about walking into the spiral, not to find the ancestors, but to join them, to step outside the linear march of death, and time and circle forever in memory. The spiral does not end. It folds, turns, whispers. Those who follow it must not look, must not doubt. Only feel the warmth of the flame and trust it knows the way. Perhaps the court of light is not a tomb, but a bridge, not where the dead go to rest, but where they linger, luminous, humming, echoing through chambers, carved to mirror the mind itself, and in some quiet corner of Sardinia, when the wind dies and the sky is black, a shepherd may still place a candle in the grass and watch it flicker, in answer not to the breeze, but to a breath from beneath the earth. For in the spiral, time is not lost, it is returned, and the dead, perhaps, never truly leave. They simply keep walking.